Hi everybody, how's it going today? Welcome to day 5 of the Minimal Wellness Priorities Reset. Today we're going to dive into habit formation, but first we're going to address a really awesome question that came in last night. So the question is about carbohydrates. And I wanted to bring this to the larger group because I think it's such an important concept to start understanding and try to grapple with a little bit. So the question is, I have a question about carbs. I'm not looking for a hardline gram count, but I get confused about what types of carbs are okay to eat more of. I see oatmeal and sweet potatoes on the meal plan. But I'm not confident about how much or how many times a week carbs are appropriate. Do you have a flexible guideline around carb intake? So, yes, I do. So carbs are really confusing for people because it's actually an area of nutrition that's kind of individualized. We all have a different capacity for handling carbohydrates in our diets. And there's a number of reasons for that. So first, we all have different genetic makeup, which means we all have different ability to handle, to digest and to break down and to handle carbohydrates in our diet. So we're all a little bit different in terms of how our bodies react to blood sugar. So that's issue number 1. Issue number 2 is that we all have different gut health status, right? So independent of genetics, we have different gut health status, and that is all over the board. In a few days, I'll talk for 2 days actually about gut health and why thinking about gut health is really important, and promoting optimal gut health in our diets and lifestyles is pretty critical. And then we also have established diet, like long-term dietary patterns. So the older you are, generally speaking, or the more your diet has been reliant on carbohydrates as a main fuel source, and for most of us, that's how we've operated the vast majority of our lives, is having, remember when we talked about the food pyramid, is having that base of the food pyramid be carbohydrates. So we're used to having 40, 50, 60% of our diet, 70% sometimes, coming from carbohydrates. And the longer you go in that pattern, the more damage, so to speak, can happen to your systems. Like you can get just an inability to process that carbohydrate over time. So it's kind of what prediabetes is. It's kind of one of the pieces of metabolic syndrome. If you have any type of like challenges around abdominal weight gain, it's one of the issues that is a hallmark issue of developing challenges around processing and just a general influx of carbohydrates through your lifetime. So those are all like the variables that kind of go into how well someone handles carbohydrates. Another one is exercise, right? So if you're really physically active, generally speaking, you can handle a bit more carbohydrate in your diet. But again, not all the time. Some of the times the genetics can outweigh that. Sometimes those long-term patterns that you've had for decades can really outweigh the fact that, yeah, you move a lot, but you still can't process those carbohydrates very well. So all that said, I do have some guidelines around how exactly to start reining in your carbohydrate content. So like I mentioned, indicators that you don't process carbohydrates well, the first and like biggest indicator is that central weight gain. So weight gain around your midsection is a really good indication that you're not processing carbohydrates properly, and that you would benefit from bringing them down pretty considerably in your diet. Other indicators that you have big energy fluctuations and crashes throughout the day. You have carbohydrate cravings and you experience intense hunger. So intense hunger is kind of a sign that your body is that it struggles to switch from using carbohydrates as a fuel source, which is the fuel source for most of us most of the day, that your body has trouble switching from carbohydrates to fat as a fuel source. So people who experience really intense hunger, especially, only 3 or 4 hours after a meal, is a way of your body telling you like you're not switching to use fat as a fuel source, because what your body should be doing is like going through the carbohydrate that you give it at a given meal, and then as you go into more of a fasted state, using your stored fat or glycogen, which is stored carbohydrate, as fuel sources. So it can shift easier. And because you can shift easier, you don't experience that super intense hunger, especially, after a relatively short period of time from your previous meal. So those are all indications that you might benefit from pulling carbohydrate content down in your diet. So some actual guidelines. If you're someone who identified with some of the things I was just talking about, central weight gain, just inability to lose weight, period, intense cravings or even moderate cravings, really intense hunger, etc. I generally recommend people try to aim for around 20% of their daily calories to come from carbohydrate. And while that's a pretty big reduction for most of us from the standard American diet, which is oftentimes 50-60% carbohydrate, it's not extremely low carbohydrate, and it's nowhere near ketogenic levels. Ketogenic levels are 5% daily calories coming from carbohydrate. So it's considerably more than that. So 20% of your daily calories coming from carbohydrates, if you have a 2,000 calorie diet threshold, is 100 grams of carbohydrates per day. Okay, so that doesn't include fiber. It's a net carb count instead of a gross carb count. So when you're reading a food label, the total carbs will be indicated, and then it will also say fiber content. So if your total carb for an item is 20 grams, but it has 3 grams of fiber, your net for that item is actually only 17 grams. So you can subtract the fiber from the amount of total carbs in order to get this net amount of carbs. And so if you're doing a 2,000 calorie diet, if that's your range, 20% of calories from carbohydrates is 100 grams of net carbs per day. So that includes added sugar. So remember back when we were talking about keeping your added sugar below 25 grams, that means there's if you do that, say your added sugar amount is 20 grams, then you have 80 or so grams to play around with more complex carbohydrates. So that's one of the reasons why just keeping added sugar as low as possible is really helpful, because then you can have a non-negligible amount of starchier carbohydrates in your diet. So what does 100 grams of carbohydrate look like? Well, you could have, so per day, this is just an example, you could have a banana, like a medium-sized banana. You could have a cup of blueberries, either or. And you could have about 3 servings, 3 1/2 cup servings of a starchy vegetable, a super starchy vegetable like sweet potatoes or regular potatoes, or grains or legumes, or pastas, right? Like you can't, it's not like I'm saying you can never have a piece of bread again or a bowl of pasta or something like that. But to keep it within that 100 grams, it ends up being about a cup and a half of like the super starchy things per day. And then the rest of your intake needs to be non-starchy vegetables, the fats that we've talked quite a bit about, and then proteins. So hopefully that gives you a good framework of like what exactly that looks like. If you're a person who doesn't struggle with abdominal weight gain or doesn't struggle as much with weight loss, is more or less at a reasonably healthy weight, you can be more flexible with that guideline, especially if you've got a good baseline of physical activity to go off of. But like 20% carbohydrate is a good way of thinking about how you might want to eat most of the time, even if you handle carbohydrates well. And then if you do handle carbohydrates well, that gives you the flexibility occasionally to be like, I want to have more carbohydrates today. Then you're not setting yourself up for the situation several decades from now where you are very sensitive to carbohydrates and you struggle processing them. So having that good balance, that like 20-30% carbohydrate balance to your diet now, if you can handle them well, is a good way of ensuring you'll be able to handle them down the road. Of course, there's no guarantees, but that's just a good way of thinking about it. So if you have, just to sort of flesh out this full picture a little bit more, if you're getting 20% of your daily calories from carbohydrate, that means you should also get about 15 to 20% of your calories from protein. Okay, so that will keep you within that range of adequacy, but not overdoing it on protein. Because contrary to popular belief, if you overconsume protein, it gets either burned as energy or stored as fat, so or converted to glucose, and it impacts your blood sugar. So just overdoing it on protein is not doing you any favors. In fact, it can contribute to, weight issues and blood sugar issues. And then so the rest of it, which is about 60%, should come from fat. And that's a big shift for most of us because most of us are used to that 50% carb threshold, 20-25% protein threshold, and then 20-25%, 30% from fat. So it's a shift, and don't expect to be able to make that overnight. But most of us feel really good given a week or two of adjustment to this 20% carbohydrate threshold. And so that's kind of the guideline that I generally use. Hopefully that was helpful. Okay, so now we are going to dive into talking about habit formation and building new habits. I think the most important thing for us to keep in mind and consider when we are contemplating building new habits is that we don't make change in like giant 180-degree pivots, or at least we don't make it very successfully, right? Like there's a lot of trial and error, and mostly error when we try to do that. And if we do end up making a big, huge pivot, like a 180-degree turn or a 90-degree turn in a habit or new behavior, it's because we had an enormous amount of motivation. And I think we underestimate or perhaps overestimate how much motivation we actually have for things. So let's talk about motivation a little bit. So motivation is your why. Okay, so it was one of the main, like getting at your motivation is, understanding what your motivators are is one of the reasons why this program is designed the way it is. That assessment of your values, exploring your priorities, both like the realistic priorities that you currently have, like what you actually spend your time on, and what you want to be spending your time on, or as a few of you found out, like saying you want a certain thing in your life, like you want to be more physically fit and you want to have more activity in your life, or you want to eat better. But realizing as you were going through your values that like, gosh, health is it's not one of my foundational values, and it's a lower priority in terms of my core values. And so seeing that and recognizing that, gosh, yeah, like on one hand, in your head, you're saying you want to elevate your health status, basically. But when you did your values work, like you're like, gosh, yeah, it's just not something I value a whole lot of. That's going to be a place of pretty extreme tension, because your values don't align with what you're wanting out of your life. And so that's a place where you need to do some additional exploration and figure out what it is that you actually do want. Do you actually want to eat better, to feel better, to have, a different weight status, etc.? Or are you actually pretty happy where you are? Like, there's nothing wrong with that. It's just you got to stop, or you got to stop making that really big tension, or reconcile it, right? Like just say, okay, so until my value on this changes, and trust me, our values change over time. That would be a hard situation to reconcile. So you have to be really clear on why you want a new habit to happen. Okay, so the more clear you can get on the why, the more motivation you will feel to actually pursue that new habit. The other thing is pain. So pain is an indicator of the level of discomfort, the level of dissatisfaction that we have around a situation. And the more pain you feel, the stronger that why will become, and therefore the stronger your motivation will be. So if you're experiencing a tremendous amount of pain around a certain thing, you're going to have more motivation to change your behaviors and avoid that pain or mitigate that pain. Okay, so for me, I'll give you several, during this whole talk, I'll give you several different examples from my personal life, probably from my partner's personal life, because I think it's really helpful to see where we draw like the ability to make a big change, and where we don't. Okay, so for me, in the last couple of years, I really struggled with wrist pain. I was doing a lot of desk work. I wasn't inactive, but I wasn't as active as I had been for a while. It was basically like after my daughter Ella was born, but while I was still working like a traditional 9-to-5 desk job. And I was finding that like my wrist pain was just getting worse and worse and worse and worse. And it finally reached the point where like I couldn't unscrew things. I couldn't weight bear on my arms. Like if I wanted to I couldn't do yoga. I had trouble carrying Ella on my right side because my wrist was so weak. So it was really starting to impact my quality of life substantially. And so the pain there was really dramatic. And because of that pain, I finally reached this point where I'm like, I have to figure this out, right? I have to change. I have to identify what's going on, first of all, and I have to change and develop some new habits to reconcile this issue, to correct this issue. And so I dove into figuring out what was going on, and essentially, like, I store tension in my neck and in my shoulders and in my upper back. And it gets worse when you're hunched over your computer, typing away for hours. It gets worse when you do repetitive work with your wrists, like playing with a mouse or using a mouse, or if you're putting pressure like on your wrist. So I made a number of changes to my habits. So I did a bunch of physical therapy work, and did like strengthening and stretching movements. And over time, it has more or less gone away. I have to keep up those stretching and mobility and strengthening exercises. And when I slack off on them, guess what comes back? The wrist pain. So we have to find out our motivation why, and then oftentimes when that why dissipates, when that pain goes away, we lose the motivation to keep doing those things. And so for me anyways, the wrist example is a really great way of saying, okay, so I changed quite a few things, right? Like when it was max pain, I was probably doing 30 minutes of quote unquote physical therapy or things around improving that situation most days of the week. I don't want to pretend that I did it every day for 30 minutes. Some days it was just a couple minutes. But most days of the week, I was spending a good chunk of my day trying to fix that pain. And guess what? It worked. But I think we get hung up on those small, like none of the things that I was doing seemed very significant, but stacked on top of each other and with persistence and with time, it paid off. Okay. So keep that in mind. So in order to really start diving into building a new habit, you have to have that why, which is your motivation. So always come back to that why. And if you have pain around it, unfortunately, all the better because your motivation will be higher. Keep in mind, the larger and harder the change, the more motivation you need. So like it or not, like me starting to do, anywhere from 15 to 30 minutes of physical therapy a day was a big change. Like I had to carve that time out, right? Like as much as we tend to like think of 15 minutes or 30 minutes or whatever as not that big of a time, and it's not. However, when you're trying to carve it out of an already pretty full day, that is a big change. And I think we have to recognize that like our capacity for large change is not what we like to pretend it is, right? Like I would not have been able to do an hour of physical therapy a day to change my wrist. Like it just wouldn't have happened. I would have made progress faster if I'd been able to do an hour of physical therapy a day, but my motivation to do that was not present. But if my pain point had been higher, for example, like my partner Josh, he had and still does have a terrible back. Terrible. He broke his vertebrae when he was a kid and didn't get it fixed, and it's a long story. But a couple of years ago, kind of when we met, he was experiencing excruciating, like debilitating sciatica pain. And long story short, his pain was so bad that he had the motivation to do an hour, 2 hours of physical therapy and exercise every day for the past 2 years. And he has made enormous progress. And for the most part, it's night and day. Like, his back still sucks, but it's monumentally better than it was 2 years ago. But that was a very, very big change. Carving out 2 hours most days of the week to do physical therapy is a really big change and a really big piece of dedication. So my point is that in order to make a huge change, you have to have a huge pain point, a huge chunk of motivation. And most of us, frankly, don't have that around little behaviors like, oh, I want to exercise more, or, oh, I want to eat better. So be realistic with yourself and be kind and gentle. Okay, so whatever your new habit, behavior is that you want to begin working on, you have to to be like the most likely to be successful, you have to break that behavior down into the smallest, like, digestible chunks you can, and tackle one chunk of that behavior at a time. And then you want to design your environment to lead you to your desired outcome. Okay, so you want to make the chunks, those individual behavior chunks, achievable and as straightforward as possible. So if your behavior, your new habit, if you want to start running, for example, if your baseline is no running, you're not going to be successful going out and saying, I'm going to run every day, or even 5, 4, 3 days a week, for 3-4 miles a day, right? Like, that's too big of a chunk. So instead, this concept of chunking takes these small incremental steps. So a way of chunking the behavior of running is, especially from a place of 0, is saying, okay, so today and 3 days a week, I'm going to go out and I'm going to run a 1/4 mile. Most of us can go out and run a 1/4 mile or jog a 1/4 mile. It might not be fun, it might not be enjoyable, but most of us can go out and do that at some pace, right? Some pace that's faster than walking. But that might be your threshold, right? Like 1/4 mile might be it. And you do that for a few weeks until you've built up enough endurance and enough ability to bump it up from there. So then it becomes a 1/2 mile. Once you get the ability to do a 1/2 mile, then you bump it up to 1/4 mile or 3/4 of a mile, and you bump it up again. And you just keep sort of titrating it up until you reach the point at which you're at the level of habit that you want to have and maintain. So it takes time, but the durability of your behavior will be far better than if you try to just go out and run a mile or two several days a week. Okay, you get discouraged when you do that, or try to do that. So let's talk now about like what behavior comes from. Okay, so we talked about motivation, but motivation is actually only one component of making a behavior change actually happen. So you need to have the motivation, which is your why. You need to have the ability, which is what I just kind of alluded to with the incremental steps towards running a mile. So the ability is really key. You have to practically and honestly assess your ability to do something, and then take your habit and build it from there, right? So don't overshoot your ability or you're going to sabotage yourself. And then, in order to make the behavior happen, you also have to have a trigger. So a cue to do the behavior that you're trying to develop, okay? So, for example, if you're doing the running thing, like setting your running shoes, your socks, maybe a music player, your sports bra if you're a woman, your shorts if you're a dude, whatever, out into a very visible place in your home, right? So that you see them, it cues you to do that behavior on specific days. A while ago, I was as part of my sort of rehabilitation of my shoulders, I was working on doing pull-ups, and we installed a pull-up bar in our old house, and we have a pull-up bar here. You can't really see it, but it's in that doorway right there. It's right there. So both Josh and I, when we're here, and when I care about doing pull-ups, I don't honestly currently care about doing pull-ups. My motivation to do them might come back, but right now it doesn't seem like a big thing to me. But having something, the trigger of walking under that pull-up bar is really helpful. So that's an environmental trigger, a cue for you to do a particular behavior. So when I was learning to do pull-ups, what I would do is I'd be working or whatever, and then I'd get up and go to the bathroom or get up and go make a meal. And every time I walked under the pull-up bar in our old home, I'd hop up and hold myself above the bar because I couldn't actually do a pull-up yet. So I'd hold myself there as long as I possibly could, and then when I reached fatigue point, I'd slowly lower myself down. And I'd just do that every single time I walked under the bar. And over the course of a few months, I developed the ability to actually do a pull-up. There's some pre-work to that, but I won't go into it. The point is having a trigger to do a behavior is one of the three components to actually doing that behavior. So just to summarize, we've got motivation, ability, and a trigger, okay? So one of the ways to build in triggers into your day is by linking a new habit to an existing behavior, okay? And the way you link is like, you think about it like, after I wash the dishes in the evening, I will do 15 minutes of calming yoga, okay? And that's an example of a behavior link that I established a few months ago to try to develop a habit around doing 15 minutes of yoga a day. If I'd already done, I didn't make that a hard rule. Sometimes I felt like doing yoga earlier in the day, and so I would do that. But like if I had reached the point in the day where I was doing the dishes in the evening after Ella had gone to bed, and I hadn't done yoga yet, then after I did my dishes, our dishes, I would go and spend 15 minutes doing yoga. And so I was linking an existing behavior of cleaning up our kitchen to the new behavior of spending 15 minutes on the yoga mat. And I want to point out here that behavior, that 15 minutes of daily yoga, was after I don't know how long of failed attempts at developing new habits around yoga. So I actually used this example in June's reset, where I said after I do the reset video on Monday and Thursday, because that was an existing behavior, I was doing a reset video most days of the week. You know, sometimes I'll do two, but generally speaking, I was recording new videos on Monday and Thursday during the June session. I had planned on going and doing a Bikram yoga class at 9:30 a.m. on those 2 days. And this is a perfect example of not recognizing my ability, right? Like Bikram yoga, which is like super hot yoga, and it's a very rigid type of yoga. Like it's very particular. Just doesn't resonate with me very well. I like some parts of the idea of it, but there are just too many pieces of it that don't work, right? Like I don't particularly like the fact that it's 90 minutes. It's a long class. It's super hot and intense. After those 90 minutes, I have to shower because you're literally head to toe covered in sweat. So it's at least a 2-hour time commitment. It's actually like a 2.5-hour time commitment when you consider like going to the studio, doing the class, taking a shower, and then getting on with your day. Like it's a long commitment. And what I recognized after doing that, trying to do that new habit for a week, yes, a week, I went twice, was that it was just not within my ability or my willingness, right? So I eventually took it in smaller chunks because I just didn't have the ability to do that. So for me, what was achievable, I could do 15 minutes of yoga, no problem. Like that is not challenging, to be completely honest. What is challenging is teaching myself to do it every single day, no matter what. And that was the habit that I really wanted to build. And now, a couple months into it, like it's much easier for me to do at least 10, 15 minutes of stretching or yoga every day. And what I've kind of morphed into is like a little bit less, so like 10 to 15 minutes every day. But some days I'll do like a much longer class. So I'll do a video here, which works much better with my daily flow, as opposed to leaving for 2 hours to a set schedule at a studio. Doing a half an hour or 45 minutes of a video here works much better. Or a couple times a week, I'm starting to go to a class that's shorter in duration and doesn't require showering afterwards. So, a couple examples there. So just keep in mind that lasting change is created by building on the cumulative total of many tiny behaviors linked together, and that forms durable habits. Okay? All right. That's it for today. Tomorrow, we will talk about time management. Peace.